there's a huge run, on these banks. So they're all going to fail. The banks are losing their deposits because they can't pay interest. And so people are yanking the money out of banks and buying money markets. So they're lending their money to the US government at 5%. And so the banks are losing all their capital in addition to the value of their loans going down. The whole banking sector is completely insolvent, thanks to what we've done over the last decade or so by loading up these banks with all this long-term, low-yielding debt, we had all these deposit insurance, so nobody really cared about what the banks were doing with their money because it was all insured by the government. But now, though, that people have seen these large banks fail, and the government has said, look, we're not necessarily going to cover your bank if you have more than the FDIC amount. It's a case-by-case situation. We're going to have to evaluate the systemic impact. The message that sends is if you're a customer of a small bank, a regional bank, a community bank, and you've got a large account, you just better get your money out. There's no reason to leave it there. They can't pay you enough interest to compete with a money market. And what if the bank fails? You may be, SOL. And so there's a huge run, on these banks. So they're all going to fail. And the government, obviously, if it wants to bail out every one of these banks, the only way it can do it is by destroying the value of the deposits because of massive inflation. Because the money to bail out the banks has to be created by the Fed. It's the only way they're going to get it. The FDIC doesn't have any money compared to the trillions of deposits. And so it doesn't even matter if your bank fails. You're going to lose money if you have a bank account, because either the bank's going to fail because the government doesn't bail it out and you're going to lose your deposits, or the government bails out your bank and your deposits lose their value because inflation destroys the purchasing power. So no matter what happens, people are going to lose a tremendous amount as this banking crisis unfolds. Well, I don't know. If he's going to resign or not, and who are they going to replace him with? But the thing Jay Powell is that, he refuses to criticize the government for the deficit spending, which is absolutely his job. That's exactly what he's supposed to do. He claims that, well, we're independent. It's the government that's supposed to stay out of the Fed, not the other way around. If the Fed is independent specifically so it can criticize the government when it does something wrong, when the government is pursuing excessive fiscal policy, it's up to the Fed chairman to call him out on it. That's exactly what Paul Volcker did. Powell likes to talk about Volcker. Volcker was a staunch critic of the deficit spending during the 1970s, and he called on Congress to not only just cut spending, but he specifically said, you got to cut defense spending, you got to cut Social Security, you got to cut Medicare, you got to reduce these deficits because they're creating inflation, they're undermining economic growth. But Powell refuses to criticize any of these deficits and just says that it's none of the Fed's business, and the Fed is just going to take whatever fiscal policy is presented to it. Well, it can't do that. If it wants to fight inflation, it can't do it unless it's willing to bankrupt the government and just say, okay, well, you're going to run these deficits, we're not going to finance them. But of course, he's not going to do that. He's going to do whatever he has to finance those deficits. He's not going to allow a default. So I don't know if he ultimately has to resign so that he can get out of Dodge. But the markets are just completely oblivious to the reality of what's going to happen. They just think that we could go back to sub 2% inflation. It's impossible. The only reason that we had it for as long as we did had to do with all the lags. But we created all this inflation, and now the chickens are coming home to roost, and they're just getting started. And as we have to ramp up the printing presses again, all they're doing is throwing gasoline on the fire. But the fire hasn't gone out. It's still burning.